Let's talk about Elric of Melniboné, or a semi-random, not wholly random, collection or selection of the Elric stories. These are from the Michael Moorcock collection. I've reviewed one book published in this collection, which is the first Hawkmoon omnibus, before on the channel. And the three I have got and read are Elric of Melniboné and Other Stories, Elric, the Sailor on the Seas of Fate, and Elric, Stormbringer. There is a logic to the selection, which is that, and it's a flawed logic, partly because I think I'd misunderstood the exact way material being broken up. Essentially, in the 60s, Moorcock wrote, I think, 13-ish Elric novellas, of which Stormbringer, for instance, is 4 of them. And he wrote a couple more technically in the 70s, which become relevant here. And those were collected in different forms over the 60s and 70s. And there's a complex textual history and publication history of those. But basically, these collect, I think, 9 of those, 13, or maybe 10, in fact. The remaining ones are in Revenge of the Rose and the Sleeping Sorceress, so which, in terms of this selection, this collection. Though I think the Sleeping Sorceress is chiefly a rewritten, lengthened version of one, so it's not the surviving novel. It is, or novella or short story or whatever, it is a short novel contemporary with the writing of the main book here, Elric of Melniboné. The other two, Elric of Melniboné, which is the chronologically first volume in the story, not in terms of writing, and Sailor on the Seas of Fate, which is another early 70s new material, one including an expansion of a novella from the 70s. They are early extra books. Stormbringer was the first published as a novel in 1965 out of 4 novellas, published unabridged and revised to match other things in 1977, so slightly later, which is the version I've got. These are chronologically volumes 1, 3 and 6. And so my mistake was I didn't clock that those other early novellas were sitting in those collections. This is what I've read though, and I think, and this is not really a preview of everything I'm going to say, but I think I'm going to get the other main chronology here, so Sleeping Sorceress, Fortress of the Pearl, and Revenge of the Rose. There's some important chronological things in there which seem interesting from what I've read here. So, what did I think of these? I have discussed the first one, Elric of Melniboné, with Liam from Liam's Lyceum. This one is about half of it. There's a couple of very short stories. About half of it is the novel or short novel, novelette, Elric of Melniboné, and then the other half really is a screenplay, a graphic novel script, which I have not read. Sailor on the Seas of Fate is a combination of, and that's about 170 pages, that main story. Sailor on the Seas of Fate is, let's have a quick check, just under 170 pages, I think, of 170 pages of Sailor on the Seas of Fate, and then 4 short stories or very short novellas or whatever, about 40 pages each, so 160 pages. Stormbringer, this is, apart from some supporting material, one long-ish novella, short novel, 230 pages. And what did I think? I liked them. They are my favourite Moorcock material. I've read these, I've read the first 4 Hawkmoon novellas, and I've read Dances at the End of Time, which is the latest of the stuff of his I've read, which was published in the mid to late 70s. And that was what I read first, and I came away very ambivalent from that. Hawkmoon I've reviewed, I came away ambivalent from, critical of several things, thinking it had gotten better by the last book. Many of my criticisms of Hawkmoon, which if you've seen that review you may remember, apply here. There are problems with Moorcock. He doesn't really write dialogue. It's very wooden. The authorial presence is very strong, but not always very attractive. His sense of pacing, he wants to write pulp, sword and sorcery, but the elision and collapse of time that implies and that he's aiming for sometimes does feel like things aren't properly dealt with, given he's dealing, generally speaking, with much bigger ideas and things he wants to deal with and think about than Lieber, than Howard, than Brackett, in terms of sword and fantasy as well, or Burroughs. He says of himself, early on in his career, he says that he hopes that there are good writers with bad or at least boring ideas. He is a bad writer with good ideas, and he's not a wholly bad writer in these earlier books, but he is sometimes a bad writer. His ideas are debatable. So what you've got to ask is, what is good about them? And they're massively popular books. They're massively influential books. One thing is, I'm not going to talk about the influence here other than to say, very plainly, using the sword and sorcery form to have a tortured hero, or rather anti-hero very often, who destroys most things he loves, who is fated to use his vampiric and evil sword to try to save the world, basically. That's interesting. That is a novel idea, and it is, though it's not sci-fi, it's indicative of a man who was big in the new wave of sci-fi in the 60s and particularly the 70s. The British kind of translation of that, major pusher of J.G. Ballard. So he's important influentially, he's creative. One thing is, actually, in general, this is a genuine point of praise, is he's constantly creative. He's constantly coming up with new, often quite perverse and strange visions, things to look at. I actually found that in terms of the aesthetics of that, which are really more pleasing in Hawkmoon. There were some really quite beautiful descriptions there. But even there, in his grim descriptions of nightmarish London, and here in the many Lovecraftian, dark, Cthulhic images, strange things like two magical towers that have appeared, which are in fact alien sorcerer siblings, and kind of the ways those work. They're marvellously creative. He has an incredibly inventive imagination. And that kind of, there's one sense is what I've criticised to do with where the pacing maybe falls apart, is sometimes what's happening is he's just so excited and throwing stuff out there that you as the reader perhaps want them to breathe more. You want to understand what's going on a bit more. He is sometimes quite good at descriptive language. That's less obvious here than it is in Hawkmoon, where I think he's superior, but there's definitely some very pretty passages. There's also some pretty dodgy passages, and the dialogue is bad. His I guess his world building is often hurried and very telescoped, but there is the sense of a vibrant living world behind what he does. His magic, his vision of the world, in terms of its systems and the powers that be, is interesting. There's something Stephen Kingian about it in the more multiversal books for King. And the Moorcock multiverse is an incredibly important multiverse because you have him starting to cross characters over as early as the 60s, I think, between the aspects of the Eternal Champion. I think it's by the 60s because of how he rewrites sections in I think in early novellas of an adventure that happens with Coram, in a book I've got but haven't read. So he is not just a pioneer there, but also he's interesting and exciting at doing that. He kind of says, oh, look at these crazy ideas, look at this wonderful place, look at this disgusting place, look at this villain, look at the way the system works, isn't that interesting? And that certainly for me makes me think of the Dark Tower. I prefer the Dark Tower, but then the Dark Tower is one of my favourite series. I actually think Elric is a much more interesting central character than Hawkmoon or Jarrett Carnelian, I think. He feels outmoded now. He has not aged as well as other famous fantasy or sci-fi heroes, particularly fantasy heroes. There is a degree to which you just think you are kind of just a disgusting monster who sort of there is a thing where maybe he's interesting because he has a conscience about his evil civilization he comes from. But that's something I actually find in some ways that seems to lessen as time goes on, and there's a lot more there's a lot of contrast about the idea that the elf-like Melnibonéans were perhaps naturally cruel. Perhaps like an animal might be naturally vicious, whereas humans, when they are chaotic and evil, That's more perverse somehow, even though they might be less chaotic and evil than the Melnibonéans were. There is, in that sense, that's part of what I mean about the kind of the way you engage with ideas is when an author says, "Look, here's some ideas." You got to grapple with them at some point, and you don't have to like them, and to like the book. But I think it is something where he's so out there with them, so obvious with them. It's hard not to come back and say, "Yeah, this reads like stuff a guy wrote in his early 20s, early to mid 20s, and perhaps at a point where he's quite psychologically tortured and showy and posy." But at the same time, there's a lot of energy and force to it. So if you set aside the attempt to philosophically muse, which I do not think Moorcock is particularly good at, he has a lot of emotional force, which sometimes translates into quite powerful moments. He also has probably the best character I've read in any of his books, in terms of just someone you actually like. Moonglum, who is Elric's friend who sometimes travels with him. There are other friends through these who travel with him, who are, I think, often also interesting. There's a kind of the Red Cleric at the back end of Elric and Melniboné, for those who know. He's good. I think some of the Ariok, the demon prince or demon lord, who Elric is closely associated with, I think is presented very interestingly and well. I think he is trying to grapple and work through stuff to do with lore and chaos and balance, and his own preference for balance, and that is something which in the wider multiverse you have to give real credit for creativity, for a willingness to pursue ideas, often explicitly from different perspectives, the same story from different heroes' perspectives, but heroes who have had different experiences or do have different experiences with lore and chaos. You would say Jerick Carnelian in Dances at the End of Time is an enemy of lore in the multiverse. I haven't read the Elric story where he meets Jerick, but you would say that Hawkmoon and probably Corum are chiefly, and I think is it that Corum seems to be chiefly on the side of lore. Hawkmoon perhaps is balanced but on the side of lore, and Elric is very much an agent of balance, but in the context of it being a chaotic world, he is therefore fighting for lore. So there's this sense that, you know, lore and chaos both lead to either stasis or entropy, basically stasis or endless entropy, and balance is what's needed. So there's a strong philosophical stakeout. His actual ethics beyond that are pretty shaky, not particularly coherent at this point. And I haven't read the high later era stuff. I mean, you think the guy's been writing for 60 years, well, for longer. He was writing as a teenager. He was an editor of a magazine in his teens, very precocious, but he's been writing this kind of stuff for 60 years, and I haven't read the more recent stuff, I can't judge that. But having read a lot of stuff from the first 20 years, you can tell that he's working stuff out. He has a strong aesthetic, but he has a strong emotional power, but I'm not sure he has the intellectual coherence or willingness to deal with a wider set of ideas to really do something good there. Perhaps that's changed. I think you can see that in his interaction in Epic Pooh with Tolkien, who, though he greatly respected Tolkien or respects Tolkien as a writer and has said so since, Epic Pooh is basically about how, whatever the truth about Tolkien's quality of writing, the problem is that Tolkien's a fascist, in his view. And I think you can see that it is the ultimate 1960s set of books, even when he's writing them in the 70s, and that he is kicking against the pricks. He is pushing open the door of authority that was already hanging on its hinges and finding no resistance and charging in, and he's here to change things. Of these, just to sum up what I think I enjoyed large sections of the novel Sailor on the Seas of Fate the best. I thought they were. There's three main sections where he is sailing, and so sailing is a joint theme, but he's sailing around different places in the world, interdimensional things like that, and that was quite fun. Portrait in Ivory is a sort of nice, it's actually a short vignette, and it actually shows something, though it still has tormented Elric, who, though I think is powerful at points, is also exasperating, as I've indicated. That's kind of an interesting vignette because of that sense that you're getting, rather than having to have lots of stuff proven, he's just doing one thing. The Singing Citadel as well I thought was quite good. Elric of Melniboné, the main story here, there's two other short stories. but Elric and Melniboné I quite enjoyed, and Stormbringer, I admired the vision and power of a guy in his early 20s writing this stuff. I loved the creativity, and I think, you know, he brought things to a bold conclusion, as Elric, in this case, has gone from being the king of this dying civilization to being a warrior at the end of the world, kind of trying to fight for the forces of law. And he's done many bad things in between, and you can see this epic sweep from, by the early 70s, he'd completed this epic sweep from that God Emperor, king of Imrir of Melniboné, all the way at the other end to kind of valiant but tormented warrior. And so I had a great deal of respect for him after seeing that main arc of his work. I don't know if I'll like other later things. I'm willing to try them. I'm certainly willing to try more Elric. I will read Corum for D&D reasons, partly. Yes, so I come away not ambivalent. That would be to suggest I simply didn't know what I think. I think I know a lot of the things I think about Elric. I liked Elric, basically. That's the synthesis, is that I had sometimes a hard time with it. I wasn't always excited to read more. Sometimes I was. I often enjoyed what he was doing. I didn't always enjoy how he did it, or the kind of person that came across to me from reading it, which I grant have nothing to do with Michael Moorcock himself. And I doubt I was any more attractive as a man in my early 20s when writing. I would recommend them to you if you want the historical importance, or if you want and it's an innovative sword and story adventure, I think is important to say. If you're interested in the historical aspects and the innovation, if you like creativity in writing, and they're relatively short books, so you can at least get through them quickly enough if you get at them. And if you're interested in tormented characters, that's what I'd say is what Elric is aimed at. If you like Elric more than me or less than me, please tell me in the comments. Tell me what you love most about Elric and other Moorcock characters, and recommend other Moorcock books. As I say, I'm interested at the moment. I think what I want to dip into next, other than Corum, is the rest of the main Elric cycle I'm fine with, some of which he wrote a lot later into the late 80s and beyond. I'm interested in some Jerry Cornelius, his sort of slightly farcical British secret agent, but who's also kind of, is he timey-wimey or interdimensional? And certainly a kind of eternal champion figure. And I'm interested in, what's the other thing I'm interested in? By the way, I do like the liveries on these. I like the kind of matching but different, quite bright psychedelic 60s liveries. I am also interested in, the Eternal Champion collection, which is Erico's, who I read about in Sail on the Sea of Stars, which does, Seas of Fate, which by the way does have a story where you have Hawkmoon, Corum, Erico's and Elric going on a mission together, which is kind of interesting. But yes, similarly, Hawkmoon, the third novella, I think, is it? Someone can correct me. When they go to New York, is it that one? Has the Eternal Champions come and help Hawkmoon do something in Runestaff. So yeah, it's fun to do that. But yes, I'm also interested in Eternal Champion with Erico's, because he's the fourth main aspect of the Eternal Champion. If there are other ones I might like more, recommend them as well. I'm open to being convinced. I have a lot of respect for Moorcock, even if I have some sort of issues with him. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now. Till next time.